Hello and welcome to this Joe Politics special. I'm Ollie Dugmore and today we will be discussing young people and Brexit. Research suggests that 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted to remain in the EU, but they will inherit a future that they explicitly voted against. And with another 1.4 million young people eligible to vote, the will of the people, and indeed Britain's entire political landscape, could well be very different to what it was in 2016. To consider post-Brexit Britain for young people in the future, I'm joined by Chloe Westley, Tom Harwood, Ash Sarkar and Will Dry. Will, in 2016, you voted Leave. You've since changed your mind. Why?
Well, I think in 2016 I voted for a better country. I voted for a bolder Britain with friends and allies across the world, with more trade, with a better NHS, which had more money, with more money for our public services. And I thought that was what we were getting. I thought that was what was on the ballot paper. But sadly, since the vote, every single promise and prediction that Leave politicians made has been dramatically underwhelming for me personally. If you look at the NHS, a record number of EU nurses and doctors have left this country since 2016. Is that going to improve the NHS or is it going to make it worse? I think it's making it worse. I also don't see the money for the NHS, which is not really coming from Brexit at all. I see the economy slowing, and are we going to get any trade deals? No. It turns out recently that we're going to be trapped in the European Customs Union indefinitely, and we're not going to be doing trade deals with any countries around the world. So the big promises that they made are almost unanimously failing to be delivered on. And when there's such a huge divergence between what you were promised and what is actually happening, I think it's perfectly right for people to campaign for a people's vote on the Brexit deal, and that's why you see 700,000 people on the streets of London just weeks ago calling for one.
Chloe, Tom, I think Will's made his position pretty clear there. What about you guys? Could you sort of make the case for a Brexit that benefits young people?
I think a good Brexit benefits everyone. It opens us up to incredible opportunities from old friends and new allies around the world. We'll be able to take advantage of those growing markets, whereas the Eurozone right now is growing at 0.2%. America's growing at 4%. We know where we need to be in order to create the growth and the jobs and the opportunities of the future. And that's not trapping ourselves in little Europe. It's opening ourselves up to the big wide world. And it's something that we so desperately need to seize. This is an amazing opportunity. And it's so far too often in the media presented as this damage limitation exercise. Actually, if we step outside this box thinking of, all change is always bad and anything that could deviate from the status quo that might have a little risk attached, like if we took no risks in life, where would we be? We would be stuck on our own little rainy island, and we'd have none of the amazing opportunities that we've been able to deliver throughout this country's history. And so this is a historic opportunity, a really big moment, and we should grab it with both hands.
Chloe?
Yeah, I agree. This is a huge opportunity, and one of the areas I think every young person will benefit is that Britain is taking back decision-making powers on a whole range of issues. So in lots of areas of policy where Britain has outsourced policy-making to Brussels, it'll be UK politicians in charge now. So instead of saying to people, we can't really change that, we have no power to change that, MPs will be accountable and they will have to say to their constituents, actually, it is in my control now. I'd agree with Will, though, that being stuck in a customs union is really not the kind of Brexit we need to be going for, because one of the huge opportunities of Brexit is this global trade that is there on offer. The fastest growing and the most dynamic economies in the world are outside of Europe. Look at Asia, look at Silicon Valley. These are countries that have expressed an interest in a trade agreement with the UK. But if the UK does proceed with this kind of half in, half out customs arrangement, we won't be able to do that, and that would be a huge shame.
Ash, do you buy it?
No, I don't buy it. But I also respectfully have a different kind of analysis from you as well. I think that in order to make sense of where it is we're going, I think we've got to make sense first of why it is remain lost in 2016. I think that there were some huge errors in terms of political messaging. There was a real, I think, laziness, an intellectual laziness, a political laziness. It couldn't sell an inspiring message. I defy anyone to remember what the slogan was. You thankfully reminded me before we went live. The thing about Take Back Control is that it had an emotional story there which resonated with lots of people. And I think that simply then trying to change the result, or I think, have a people's vote where the hoped for outcome is to remain in the EU, is to, I think, make a quite dreadful error, which is to mistake the vote to leave the EU to be one that's about the precise organisation of particular institutional arrangements. I don't think it was about that at all. I think it was about a decisive break with the politics of always, the politics of necessity, of technocrats, of distance from sovereign decision-making institutions. And that rupture of 2016, I think, was something which was really important. It reminded people that your vote matters and you can transform the politics which affects your everyday lives. Now, I don't necessarily think that those changes are always necessarily a good thing, but I do think that there are costs with trying to turn the clock back on that.
Chloe, I'd just like to pick you up on that, actually, because you mentioned there sort of the institutional benefits, sovereignty, accountability, etc., which, they're fantastic to talk about in a theoretical sense, but perhaps your average person on the street, someone in Preston, how does having greater accountability for their MPs benefit them in their day-to-day lives?
So one of the big ones was how much money, taxpayers' money, was going into the EU. So when you pay your taxes, you work hard, you give your money to the UK government. Some of that is given to the EU. So you see some of that in EU grants and that kind of thing. But the UK government doesn't control how it's spent, and about half of it you never see it again. And so I think the taxes you pay on your salary should go towards UK public services that you pay for. I think another area of policy which will impact people, which was spoken about in the referendum, is immigration. Now, as I'm a young person, I'm also an immigrant. I came here from Australia. I think the immigration system is discriminatory. I think it does favour EU nationals. You have free movement with a small area of the world and then very harsh restrictions on the rest of the world. I think having a fairer, skills-based system would be hugely beneficial. That's the one thing I'm really excited about, hopefully happening when we leave the EU. Another area of policy which might not impact young people directly, but many small businesses are the job creators in the country. And small businesses really backed Brexit because they don't really have the power or the resources to go and lobby Brussels for regulations. They don't have access to that decision making. So it was the larger businesses that were lobbying Brussels, that were arguing for rules and regulations in their favour, often actually not very free market policies. They're policies that keep the competition out. So if you're a big company, multinational, it's not in your interest actually for smaller businesses to compete with you. So of course you're going to argue for more restrictions and more regulations for entering that market. So I think that having closer decision-making powers in the UK will, I think, help small businesses, and in turn that will create more jobs. And we've got nearly huge levels of employment in the country, but I think one thing that young people care about, I care about, is having a job and an opportunity. And those are 3 examples. I hope I've given you.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Will, you're a young man. You're not in the north. You're in the south. But does that sound good to you?
No, I mean, I'm sorry, I just dispute a lot of what Chloe said. I think with regards to money, how much does the Brexit deal cost? It costs 47 billion. And how much is Brexit costing our economy every single week? Well, the Centre for European Reform says it's 500 million every single week. Hang on, that could be going to public services. It's
that's
not.
An argument for leaving, because
we've hired 16,000 civil servants to deal with Brexit. We haven't hired 16,000 policemen or nurses.
But a payment is surely preferable to sending billions every single year. I mean, these payments are going to end, and that was one of the arguments we made. This is UK taxpayers' money, and that should be.
But what are we getting in return for the 50 billion? We're getting a blank sheet of paper, and we don't see
the 50 billion is obligations that we're paying now.
We don't see.
We're paying that now.
Let's give Will a chance to make his point. And then
we have secured nothing in this negotiation. We haven't even discussed what our future trading relationship is. We could be given this disastrous deal after we pay this money. And also, I just respond to Ash briefly. Now, in 2016, I think that people voted for radical change. I think in 2017, people also voted in large numbers than ever before for radical change, with a lot of people voting for Corbyn. Now, I think that there is a coalition, a sizable coalition in this country, which unites young people, but also people all around the country, especially in areas that voted Leave and also for Corbyn, that really want to see big change in this country. But I don't think Brexit, on the actual terms that it's being delivered, is that change. I think it's going to make us poorer. I think it's going to give us less opportunities to fix the problems that led to that vote in the first place. So the sticking plaster is not Brexit, it's to tackle that.
I mean, look, I'm not a Lexiteer by any stretch of the imagination. I voted Remain, and I would probably vote Remain again. I just don't necessarily think think people's vote is a great idea. I think that something that we need to bear in mind is that, one, there was an economic malaise gripping this country before 2016. So we were still on course for, well over a decade of lost wage growth, had low productivity. And I think the major change, after Brexit has been growth estimates have been revised down. So for the foreseeable future, we're looking at less than 2%. And I think that this idea that Brexit will present an economic crisis which would make the political promise of Corbynism impossible, it just isn't quite true. I think it will make some things harder, but it will make some things easier. I think particular with the floated programmes of nationalisation. When we're talking about distance from sovereign decision-making institutions, and I think a lack of economic control, is that unfortunately the EU has represented that, particularly in southern European countries.
So has Westminster.
So no, I'm in full agreement with you, which is why I'm not defending the Westminster status quo either. What I'm saying is that a uncritical celebration of EU membership, I don't think will achieve your goal either. I think what you actually need to do is to present a credible platform for reforming the EU. I just don't think that the Remain side has done that. You look at what's going on in Italy currently with the rejection of the draft budget, 'cause it's not, met some standards set by the EU, even though I think by the letter it actually does, is that has been something which has really emboldened Lega. So now they're polling at an all-time high. I think the problem has been that the lack of democracy and this real, rigid neoliberal ideology at the heart of the EU, so that's been something which has emboldened the far right across Europe. And it's something which I think Remainers such as ourselves need to engage with in a really robust and I think self-critical way.
Okay, guys, I'd like to give Tom a chance now to respond to Will.
Just on all of that, we're trying to diagnose the Brexit vote as if it was about anything other than the EU. It was about X, Y, Z, financial crisis, whatever. Since the UK signed up to the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, there has been a really sizable Eurosceptic majority in this country who doesn't like the idea of signing up to an institution that unaccountably makes laws for us, that has its own flag and president and even a national anthem. This is an organisation that's marching towards some sort of quasi-statehood. And it's not something that people in this country want. We don't want European citizenship. There is value in nation states that don't consist of 500 million people.
You say that, but I think we look at the outcome of the referendum and the campaign that was done beforehand. No one's talking about leaving the single market, etc. Is the validity? Is the validity of the result? Sorry, just allow me to finish. Is the validity drawn into question because the version of Brexit that's being put forward now by Theresa May's government is different to the one present during the campaign?
I really take issue with this. We heard a list of things that apparently aren't coming true at the beginning from Will. The NHS is getting an extra £394 million a week.
Not because of Brexit.
That's the biggest increase. Do you think that would have happened without the referendum? Of course it wouldn't. Well, this is the biggest cash injection in the NHS's history. We heard from the Remain campaign before the vote that we'd have at least 500 million people unemployed, 500,000 people unemployed as a result of the vote. We heard that there'd be an immediate Brexit recession, an emergency budget. None of this happened. None of this happened. And actually, all of the things that the Leave campaign said, whether it was providing more money for public services, easing that austerity that we've seen, whether it was bringing back democratic accountability to this country, whether it was even sort of the idea that we're a strong economy, that we're not going to fall into recession, that there isn't going to be this global collapse or a third world war, or all of the ridiculous scare stories that we heard during that campaign. Actually, what we've seen is a remarkable media campaign trying to discredit the results. But really, when you look back at those debates throughout the referendum campaign, broadly what was said has happened.
Where I differ with you is this idea of, there is a Eurosceptic majority in this country, is that what polling has showed us that there's a great deal of volatility in the UK. This is also where I differ with the idea of a second referendum would be nailed on to win. I think Remain are banking a lot on the idea of a 4-point lead in the past 2 years. But I think there's a great deal of volatility. I think that the electoral coalition that was put together to deliver the 2016 vote, I think it was more diverse than lots of people gave it credit for, but I think that's now falling apart. Because I think these grand promises being made about, say, a more egalitarian approach to visas and freedom of movement for people from the global south, let's be real, that's not going to happen. The image of the migrant that was presented by the Leave campaign was a distinctly racialised one for the most part. People weren't thinking about EU migrants from like Spain or Italy. People were thinking about Eastern Europeans. People weren't thinking about Australians. They were thinking about people racialised as Muslim. That was the image of the migrants at our borders.
And spoke to Leave voters and was on the doorstep. I'd like to counter that point when you're finished.
I've conducted also extensive interviews with Leave voters, both in the north and also in the kind of outer ring of like Leave voting London. And what was really striking to me is that when talking about migration, it was predominantly the figure of the Muslim that was this kind of, scare figure there. And I think that the problem is that neither side is willing to look at the ways in which racialised fears were stoked by both the Leave campaign and also by the centre-right who were tasked with fighting the Remain campaign as well. That's I don't think that Leave won the campaign. I think that Remain lost it.
Let's go to Chloe.
I think we might have won that on the Take Back Control front. But I want to pick up on your point about Europe and the rise of populism in Europe. This is something that I'm really concerned about because there are lots of people in Europe who are very angry that the EU is taking away decision-making powers from national governments. They are frustrated that political parties are not talking about immigration. They are not addressing any concerns. And so when you repress an issue in public debate, people will go or vote for parties, the only party talking about it. I think there needs to be an adult discussion and a more centre discussion about immigration. At the moment, the only people really talking about it are either those who are very pro-free movement with the whole world, or they're very anti, and they're very, very far right and they want strict controls. I think most people are in the middle. They want a fair and controlled immigration system. Open Europe did a really interesting report about a year after the referendum where they did a detailed study on attitudes to immigration. They found that numbers weren't really the primary concern. It was the government being in control. So they wanted a system that was controlled by the government, and the word fairness kept on coming up as well. A system that treats everyone equally. And I think the Australian style system where I come from is probably a template to base a new immigration system from, which the UK government I don't believe have ruled out. And there was a report, you might know the name of it, recently, that it was the Migration Committee, I believe, put it out, where they proposed a similar system to Australia. So that is on the table, and the current plan is actually to introduce a system that is more fair. I do think there were some people that voted Leave just because they hated the idea of immigration or immigrants, but I very strongly believe they're in the minority, and all the polling and the evidence shows that. And I really would hope that in the reporting of this, fears aren't stoked up in a way that makes people believe that Britain is a country that hates immigrants or hates the idea of immigration. It's not a radical idea or proposal to say, actually, I think my national government should be in control of immigration policy. That is not a racist remark to say. It's entirely sensible, actually, to say that we should have a system that you can plan for the future from. If you have an uncontrolled system, you don't know how many school places you're going to need, or you can't plan for infrastructure. So regardless of the numbers, the government having control, I think, would be a very good thing. And it works very well in Australia. We have much higher immigration per capita to the UK, but it's not really this explosive, difficult issue that politicians are afraid to talk about. This cross-party consensus.
So the thing that you said about it's only the populists and the kind of insurgent right that have been talking about immigration is just factually wrong. If you look at the issues that David Cameron campaigned on, some of the promises he made, particularly with the idea of a cap, I think that shows that the centre-right was fighting quite hard on it, particularly when it came to general election time. Similarly, in Europe, if you look at the platform of, say, Mark Rutte in the Netherlands. So he is committed to the European project, committed to freedom of movement, but you look at what he's had to say, particularly on immigration from outside of Europe. If you look at the things that he said about, the preservation of Dutch culture from, interlopers, it is, a very kind of hard nationalist platform in that sense. So I think that if you look at the politics of the European centre-right, that frankly, that doesn't stack up. Similarly, I think bringing it back to, I think issues around age, memory, and the future. I think that we need to understand immigration not in terms of simply numbers and resources. We have to look at the role that immigration plays in the cultural imaginary. Is that one of the things that came up in the interviews that I conducted, is that when people who had voted leave were talking about what had changed for the worse, they were talking about migrants just being there, seeing someone who looked different. And they didn't express any personal antipathy towards me as a person of colour, but there were these kind of giveaway gestures of like, they're all coming over here, like gesturing towards me as like, having come here. And I was like, well, true, I had to go from Tottenham to get to Barking to interview you, but I don't think that's the kind of travel that you meant. And that, those seeds have been planted not by the populist or insurgent right, but by the politics of the centre. It's been something that was played on by Thatcher, something which David Blunkett during the New Labour era played very strongly, and similarly David Cameron, right? But because immigrants have always been a sort of useful scapegoat for the things that you feel you're not in control of. Here's an easy way to picture that. It's
are
this
we not
person who looks and sounds
here?
different.
Are we not talking about a sort of almost a scapegoating here of the EU, perhaps for this issue? Much the same way, perhaps in the far right in Europe, they're sort of pointing the finger at the EU as the problem. But are there other issues that perhaps this Brexit debate is obscuring, like a wider economic malaise, maybe even a social malaise that is sort of present across these countries?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Like if you look at
synchronised.
If you look at the 30 areas which have the worst social mobility in the country, like all of them voted to leave. 21 of them voted to leave by over 60%. Now, these areas are now shifting. They think it's an awful idea, or they're changing their mind. But I think it's absolutely true that when you have been ignored by both Brussels or Westminster or those with power, you are absolutely entitled to look around you and think, my NHS doesn't have enough money, there aren't enough houses, my kids aren't going to have sufficient opportunities, and to say, I'm voting for change. And that's what I think happened. And they are being absolutely betrayed now by politicians who are delivering a deal that they know is going to harm those communities first and foremost.
If you look, condescended to by people like you.
No, they're not. Like, I'm sorry, that's just nonsense. If you look at the reports done by the Treasury, done by other economists, the areas.
Treasury.
Oh yeah, let's laugh. Like the areas that are worst hit by Brexit is the North East, it's the West Midlands. These people
the Treasury
have
are the people that said there'd be 500,000 to 700,000 people unemployed as a result of Brexit.
Look,
actually, what's happened is
So
we
the
have the
Leave campaign
highest
not telling
unemployment
you
since.
either?
You are gambling their futures on your own economic arrogance.
Sorry,
I think that is
are
horrific.
do these people have no sense of identity, no personhood, no ability to make up their own
Well,
minds and make their own votes?
Wales now backs Remain. The North East is
Sorry,
now 50-50.
based on the same polls that said we'd remain in the first place.
Well,
I mean,
the
come on.
polls have been
Really, what we're looking at now
be
is
fair,
a
the
very
surveyation-
Anglocentric point
Sorry,
of view.
guys, let's just let Tom make his point.
This is an incredibly Anglocentric point of view, saying that there are places in the UK that are deprived, there are places in the UK that are more hostile to migrants, and they voted to leave the EU. Actually, when we look at comparative studies with Europe, there are places in the southern Europe that are much, much more deprived than the UK, but actually more pro-EU. There are places that, I mean, the UK is one of the 3 most pro-migrant countries in Europe.
I didn't say that.
Really, sort of like miles ahead in terms of pro-diversity attitudes, and yet we're the most Eurosceptic country in
I don't
Europe.
think this
So
is
I
the
don't
point.
think
This
we
is
can,
the point.
we
Those
can
people
make
are not
this comparison.
Eurosceptic. They voted for change. They voted for change.
Sorry,
on
people
the
who've
ballot.
voted to leave the EU are not Eurosceptic.
No,
I think this is some
Tom,
quite
they aren't
incredible
Eurosceptic like
cognitive
you. They don't
dissonance
care
here.
about,
Look,
the
there is a consistent strain of public opinion since 1992. About 2/3 of people who don't like the direction the EU is going in. That doesn't always translate into them wanting to outright leave it, but it does mean that they're hostile, and there isn't this great romantic love for this idea of an EU state where we all sort of sign up to a blue flag with yellow stars, as you see some people waving about on TV. There isn't that sort of outright nationalism amongst people for this amazing new project. This isn't some kind of dream on a hill that people are running towards. It's not. There is no movement for that in this country.
So, Tom,
most people are Eurosceptic.
If we're talking, something that Will mentioned there is a housing crisis. The housing market is one that young people cannot afford to enter.
Broken.
How does leaving the EU fix that problem?
It doesn't.
I really hope that a no-deal Brexit actually crashes the housing market, and then I can, maybe get some place with my boyfriend. That would be lovely.
It was interesting, wasn't it, when George Osborne said, "Oh yeah, no, but voting to leave the EU will crash the housing market," and young people or someone like,
I could afford it.
yeah.
No, I mean, the solution to the housing crisis is to build more houses. That's nothing to do with the EU. Sure, but a lot of things that happen. Not everything that happens in this country is to do with the EU. I mean, I think we'll be on the whole better off if we leave the EU, but that doesn't mean that everything to do with our everyday lives is always affected by it. Quite a lot of things are.
So Ash, could you elaborate on that then, sort of how Brexit is perhaps almost distracting from these issues that are affecting young people?
I mean, I think that, the problem with Brexit is that it's like it just sucks the oxygen out of the room, and you can't talk or focus on anything else. And this has been my beef with actually both sides of this camp, is that it presents Brexit as the defining political cleavage of our time. I actually think that it's the defining political cleavage of our time is a sort of deep hostility towards neoliberal globalization, and those two things together are really important. We've seen an absolute decimation of home ownership amongst young people over the past 20 years. And if you want to talk about, selling out young people's futures, which I do think has happened particularly because of austerity, let's look at the £2 billion shortfall that children's social care is facing by 2020. The fact that the most deprived councils in this country are 6 times worse off than the richest councils in this country. Let's look at the fact that the universal credit rollout is leaving lone parent families of the kind that I was raised in worse off by the tune of £3,000 a year, and that's a lot, and that would be happening regardless of whether or not we were in the EU. And the issue is, I think that we've started talking over and talking on behalf of those intensely socioeconomically vulnerable households simply in terms of Brexit. What do they really want? What do they really mean? And we've, I think, stopped looking at those real bread and butter issues, which would be being felt acutely, even if we'd managed to, wipe 2016 in its entirety out of the history books.
I completely agree that Brexit is not the defining social cleavage of our time. I don't think it's what defines people in this country at all. But it is without doubt the most important, most impactful decision that this country and its people have to take at this point in time. I absolutely believe that. I'm sorry. And I think that if you ignore that, and if people bury their heads in the sand and think it's all going to be fine either way, people, our futures, people in this country will be facing a far darker future than one we
I agree that it's important.
I disagree. That's the most important decision we have to take at this time. I think the most important decision we have to take at this time is decarbonising our economy. But that's something which isn't even on the table.
Let's get back to Brexit. Thank you, though, Ash.
Boiled to death.
Well, what I take real issue with is that since the referendum, I had friends who voted Remain. I think they had really good reasons for voting Remain. I had conversations with them. I understood their arguments.
You're still friends with them?
Absolutely.
Are they still
you shouldn't
friends
let
with
it
you?
get to I hope so.
Go on.
But since the vote, what we've seen is this snobbery and belittling and condescension towards people. There are all these conspiracy theories about why the vote went this way or that way, all these theories about, well, it was this or that, as if the idea that people, adults in this country, aren't able to watch a debate, to read newspapers, to look into things themselves and just make a reasoned decision. There seems to be this idea that it just isn't possible that on balance, people in this country looked at the facts and the situation and said, actually, we're probably better off not shackled to the EU. I find that really surprising, actually. That's something I hadn't apprehended when I was campaigning for Brexit. I didn't think it would be possible for politicians to stand up and say, I know better than you, or you're too poor or stupid, or you weren't really voting for Brexit, you didn't understand what the EU was, that's far above your station, you were just sad because of this issue or that issue, so we're going to have another vote, just to make sure, and then if you do that, we might ignore you anyway, because, we don't trust you with those decisions. I take real issue with that, and I also take real issue, Will, with the way that a lot of young people have spoken about the older generation with a lot of disdain and said things like, they stole my future, they did this or that. You can disagree with the decision that older people make, but to question their motives, to question whether they voted with the best interests of their children and their grandchildren. That to me is just phenomenal, and it's really, really unfair. And actually, people that have lived a bit longer, when I meet someone who's older than me, I don't talk over them. I listen, because they've actually seen some things that I haven't seen. I probably have something to learn from them.
That may well be very true, but do you think it's fair that those people who, and I'm being frank here, will not live to see the consequences of this vote potentially? Do you think it's fair for them to put that on people who will?
Do you think it's fair that people that have really serious illnesses have a vote? I mean, this is such a ridiculous idea. This is a preposterous and dangerous idea. To remove suffrage from a group of people is...
He didn't suggest that.
But that's what the conversation is about, isn't it? It's about, should old people have a say in this, because they're probably, let's be honest, they're probably going to die soon. And all these articles about, here's how many people have died since the vote. Oh, there's more young people that are now 18. Maybe the result would be different. I mean, come on, that's not how democracy works. It was put to the people on June 23rd in 2016, and everyone had a vote. And that was important. And you know what? I think it's estimated over 1 million people voted for the first time in their life. They never voted for anything. They didn't think that their vote would mean anything. But on that day, they were told by the government, this vote is going to matter. It's actually going to change things. It's going to be really important, regardless of how you vote. And so they went out and voted. What happens if this isn't implemented, or it's implemented in a halfway house, or if there is a second vote? What happens to those people who are already very angry and disenfranchised by the system? I mean, what do they do? What are they supposed to think about the political system in this country? I mean, I really do worry about that, and I worry about the rhetoric that is used to describe Leave voters. I don't think they're stupid. I don't think Remain voters are stupid. I think people in this country, on balance, made a decision, and nobody should condescend or use that kind of language about any area of the community.
We should be clear as well, like, we haven't actually said that, but I would like to talk about it now. We have a minimum voting age. What's to say we can't have a maximum?
Because
what's the
everyone deserves a
idea-
vote.
Yeah, what's the idea behind the
do-
minimum voting age? It's the age at which...
You're cognizant.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, personally, I think that the age from which you can pay tax should be the age at which you can vote.
16.
So I believe in lowering the voting age.
You
And
can pay tax from any age.
Oh,
There's
like
no
the 18
floor.
I'm talking about like...
So like child actors who are
unequal.
4 years old, they pay tax.
Okay, all right. So young Macaulay Culkin, like, rinse him for everything he's worth. But I genuinely think that the voting age should be lowered. I don't think there's any good arguments against it. And I think that this idea of because there's an outcome that you don't like, you disenfranchise a section of the population is a really dangerous road to go down. I think that the conversation that we should have, rather than if we just waited a bit longer, more of them would have died, is more about planning for the future and people's sense of investment in the current political system as it is. Lots of young people didn't come out and vote, and lots of young people who I've spoken to and interviewed felt intensely alienated from the political process
In
2016.
More young people voted in 2016 and 2017.
I'm talking about like the interviews that I conducted in the Leave voting area.
Fair enough, yeah.
And what was interesting about lots of the people that I spoke to is that there was a sort of shared emotional tenor amongst the young people I spoke to who didn't vote and older people I spoke to who voted Leave, and it was one of profound alienation from the current status quo. And there was sort of two registers in which that was articulated. For older people, there was a real sense of nostalgia, talking about how things used to be. This vision of a golden age wasn't necessarily consistent across the people that I spoke to, but it was something which was really distinct. And with the young people that didn't vote, it was, there is no future for me, things aren't going to go well, I'm not going to vote, and it was almost nihilistic. And that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of the importance of the politics of rupture and the lack of sustainability of things as they are, is that I don't think that it's possible to put the cat back in the bag without there being, I think, some very dire political and social consequences in terms of people's faith in their democracy and how it functions. At the same time, I think this argument that a vote like 2016's can't represent a wider set of values, a wider set of concerns, I think is just as condescending as the attitude amongst Remainers that, you know, you're identifying. I think that people vote based on a variety of things.
Okay, Ash, thank you. That's a very eloquent and perhaps slightly bleak place to leave it, but why not? We'll do it there. Thanks very much for joining us for this. We'll see you next time.